Welcome and thanks to so many people for coming out. We are going to bring in some more chairs. There's a lot of interest for this topic. And that topic is the emerging sensor architecture that will come to underpin the future missile defense enterprise. The report we're putting out today is probably our most technically complex to date, and also represents a new foray for our in-house modeling and simulation efforts. First of all, I want to really acknowledge the very considerable effort put into that report by the lead author, Masao Dahlgren, who will be here momentarily. Researching, modeling, and analyzing this problem, I think there was about 1 million simulation runs that we did to make this happen. Next, I want to acknowledge and thank those who made this possible on the sponsorship side, namely General Atomics, L3Harris, Leidos, and Lockheed Martin. And I want to thank the representatives from those companies who came out today to be in person. ANSYS AGI and Iroquois Systems generously provided some in-kind contributions on the software side, which made it possible to depict visually, and I would say very colorfully, what would otherwise have been a little more of an abstract topic. I also really need to thank all of the subject matter experts who lent just a whole heck of a lot of time, most of whom anonymously, that we got to listen to over the course of the effort. So I'm just going to say a few words here at the beginning and then turn it over to Masao to summarize the report. Now, as one DASD John Hill testified about 10 days ago, in this era of missile-centric warfare, active missile defenses have become an essential element of a credible military force posture. Missiles are no longer niche weapons, they're weapons of choice. And at CSIS, we try to look across the full missile spectrum from mud to space, from counter-UAS to cruise missiles to hypersonic things. But you cannot defend against what you cannot see. Now, many of the threats depicted here, of course, combine high speeds and unpredictable non-ballistic trajectories and other features to stress legacy defense designs and surface-based sensors, and thus the need for a new architecture. Now, last year, Masao and I put out a report on the subject of hypersonic defense, seen here, which noted that the characteristics of hypersonic missiles may come to define the future of missile warfare, and as such ought to be a key driver for transforming the legacy ballistic missile defense system into the missile defense system. It identified a resilient and persistent space sensor layer as the single most important element of that future. Today's report, Getting on Track, builds on that past work. Now, one thing we realized early on is that there's no such thing as a perfect sensor design, architecture design. It's an exercise in trade-offs and is as much art as science. And furthermore, institutional and policy assumptions inform architecture design, but they're often too implicit. And so unpacking those trade-offs and those assumptions, making them explicit, is the purpose of this report, to hopefully improve the public discussion related to missile tracking and missile defense. So we don't recommend a given architecture, this number of satellites, although it certainly contains many illustrative alternatives. It instead elaborates those trade-offs, identifies principles, and highlights some temptations to avoid. Now, our team's resident guru of defense budget data, Wes Rumbach, compiled this information and a lot of others in the report. And what you see here is kind of how the past emphasis on missile warning has begun to give way to more missile tracking. And so that witnessed the spending depicted in orange relative to blue. We're kind of right at that shift point. And a lot of that funding is still in the out years at the end of the FYDP. But not all tracking, of course, is of sufficient quality support fire control. That same funding, when converted to orbital types, reveals similar trends, perhaps not surprising. A shift from GEO and HEO to especially proliferated LEO. And so this report kind of comes in and at a point in the conversation, moving from space sensors would be nice to have to all proliferated LEO discussions to a mix would be nice, and now it's kind of a question of how do you go about finding the right mix. Now, over the course of the panel today, we're going to hear reference to various institutions and the efforts to get after this problem. These include the LEO and emergent newer attention to MEO across several SDA tranches, SSC epics, and other efforts as well. But it's one thing to track a threat generally and another to do something about it, to be able to do something about it. And so the requirements for fire control come in part from the defender. There are also relative measures contingent on the performance of other elements in the missile defense kill chain. And you've seen a fair bit of attention to this with recent defense bills, and of course the upcoming HBTSS launch and test, and then kind of evaluation before it goes to SDA. One final word about our approach, and that is the report's emphasis on orbits and inclinations applicable to so-called regional coverage. The words regional and persistent are sometimes used differently, but when we talk about regional, we're really talking especially about the latitudes most relevant to Indo-PACOM, and that's what you see here on the right. So many of the necessary policy programs and institutions are in place or coming online, and what remains is a discussion about oversight, resourcing, systems engineering authorities to make this future architecture resilient, timely, and capable. To be resilient, it must be orbitally diverse. To be timely, it has to deploy with an eye to graceful deployment and sufficient lower latitude coverage. And finally, it must deliver the quality of data necessary for missile defense. That's where I'm going to pause. I'm now going to invite Masao Dahlgren up here to walk us through the report's findings and recommendations. Over to you, Masao.
Thanks so much, Tom. This report really wouldn't be possible without Tom, so I just want to thank him for his time. I wouldn't be up here without him, and this was a really important report, so I'm glad to be a key part of making it happen. But I think Tom gave a great 60,000-foot view. We're at an inflection point for missile defense, and that starts with sensors, right? This report is going to show you why that's the case. The goal here of the report is to be a cheat sheet for the policymaker. There's a lot of constellations coming online, and we want the policymaker to understand what the measures are for success. Sensors are the first link in the missile defense kill chain, and you design every other requirement for missile defense around them. So it's so important to get this piece right. This report does two things. Demystifies the trade-offs involved in these constellations and these acquisition programs. These technical trade-offs directly impinge on the schedule of an architecture. They impinge on the data quality you give to the warfighter. They are the first link in this chain, and you have to design every requirement around them. They impinge on doctrine. They impinge on money. They impinge on every other piece. And after reviewing these pieces, we want to go into pathways and pitfalls. We aren't systems engineers. We won't prescribe what to build. But instead, given the policy, budgetary, and technical trends, we want to identify what to look out for. So that's the report. The first piece of this is unpacking trade-offs. This is the reason why we've picked such a knowledgeable panel. We want to connect the discussion of technical trade-offs with broader policy trends, missile defense, and the Hill. And it's the first time we've used some key modeling and simulation tools, industry standard tools, to visualize this. On the left there, you see some of the simulation runs, an analysis of all the perfect and optimized constellation designs we used in the content of this report. There's other things. We're trying to unpack a really complex network of trade-offs here, and so we do coverage analysis. We do signature analysis. And that's probably where I'll start. The whole story of this starts with sensors. They drive every other piece of the puzzle when it comes to designing these constellations. And so there's two things I really want to tell you. I think the first thing I want to say is that the same things that make hypersonic weapons so unique and so difficult to counter are the same things that introduce new vulnerabilities into the system. We'll be talking mostly about infrared sensing, but I just wanted to open this discussion and say that there are other signatures to look for. The surface of the vehicle reacts with the high pressure air, with the plasma formed and generates unique gas products that could be detectable in other wavelengths. And so I just want to nod to that and say that that's important. But second, I want to tell you how the trade-offs over sensors affect the final architecture. We're primarily talking about infrared sensing here, and I want to show you some of the complexity of this problem. They change in brightness over time, but I don't think that a think tank has ever shown you what those brightness changes look like as the view angle changes, as the background signature changes, as the satellite moves, and the hypersonic weapon moves over its trajectory. This problem is so challenging in part because hypersonic weapons are subpixel-sized targets. They're smaller than the pixels used to actually image them, and so their signatures get diluted with all their surroundings. It's akin to trying to find a cup of tea that you've dropped into a swimming pool, figure out how hot it is. Of course, that's a simplification. In reality, the field of view will be much larger and the sensor won't know where the target is. And because these target signatures are so dim, you need to extract them from their backgrounds with machine. This is something we did in our analysis. On the left, or I guess on the right, you see the raw signature that comes out of our simulated environment. We have a hypersonic model. We texture it with various temperatures. We don't model plumes or we don't model wakes, but that's the signature we see based on open source information. The middle slide, that shows the optical flow of each pixel over 20 frames that we captured. It was an algorithm that we used to extract the motion vector, and those motion vectors are then illustrated in the center. And then, of course, on the end, you can extract the hypersonic signature that way. But these are things you can't see. And the reason why we talk about this trade-off is because we're talking about sensor fields of view. And I think the panelists will get into this more. Ideally, with sensors, you want to get a large field of regard so you can cover a larger area. But this comes with trade-offs you might make to resolution, to fidelity that you can fix with larger focal planes, with a better supply chain, but we'll get into that later. And those differences matter, right? Here you see two different architectures, completely different fields of regard for each. One sensor has a maximal 120-degree field of regard, and the other sensor has just 10 degrees less area viewable. The one on the left is 91 satellites, and the one on the right is 312 satellites. That's a real difference based on just a tiny difference in sensor performance. So these trade-offs are linked to orbital and schedule trade-offs. They're linked with a bigger story about how we think about these architectures. And in this report, we talk about the many decision points that exist and why the Department of Defense has placed assets in these orbits. But I want to focus on one thing. I want to talk about what it takes to get regional persistent coverage. The late 2020s will be a decisive and dangerous period. How do we ensure that we're covering the Indo-PACOM latitude band persistently on that time frame? And if there's one takeaway here, it's this one. You can propose two constellation designs that generate the same amount of coverage at the end, but those two designs can have dramatically different ramps of capability on the way to getting there. And since we care so much about persistent regional coverage, how do we go and think about that? It's good practice, for example, to have many constellations of highly inclined orbits if you want to efficiently cover the globe. If you look at this one orbital ring, you'll achieve global coverage at some point, but it's not persistent. You're covering just one portion of the globe, and the satellites will go around and they'll cover everything eventually. But we want to get to this kind of persistent coverage. This constellation of 135 satellites in low Earth orbit delivers global and persistent coverage, and it's made with those same orbital planes that you saw earlier, highly inclined ones. But that's the same constellation with 7 out of 9 planes deployed. You're not getting persistent coverage when you're already 80% of the way there. The problem with this constellation is that it doesn't achieve persistent coverage until you reach the very end. And so the question is, how do we get to that blue line? How do we fill out the belly in that curve? This report notes that one approach might be to split coverage up into several steps. You could deploy a lower inclination constellation earlier that might get that regional persistent coverage you want, and it would look something like this, before you step it up to a combination of a lower and a higher inclination to get that polar coverage we care about later. This is the direction that SDA is moving towards, now that Tranche 2 includes lower inclination payloads. We think that's a welcome development, and it's why it's highlighted so much in the report. And for reference, here's what that coverage looks like. The idea is that you can step things up with those constellations, but it raises a related issue, which is that we don't get coverage of these regions we care about so much, most densely, right? We don't get dense coverage near the equator, we get it near the poles. And we do some analysis to show, right, that these inclinations are thinnest, or this coverage is thinnest near the equator. The question is, how can we get more coverage near the equator in the regions we care about in other ways? One method might be to, if you look at this highly inclined constellation, you'll notice that the biggest holes are in the middle there, the middle of the map. And so an alternative approach might be to leverage the unique benefits and drawbacks of various orbits. A lot of arguments have been advanced for why mixed orbits are useful, for resilience especially, but we haven't seen an argument that has advanced that they're also useful for coverage and for filling in gaps that we might otherwise deprioritize. We notice that here, for example, with just 8 additional MEO satellites, you can compensate for a lot of the thinness near the equator in LEO. A final point. We can also fill out that little gap in the curve by adding underlays. And a key point made in the report is that we could use airborne sensors to provide point coverage of regions we care about. The Missile Defense Agency has previously tested systems for boost phase applications. This technology is mature, and you can really advance and expand coverage of these low-flying targets, near regions like Guam. There are obviously a lot of trade-offs to consider in how many aircraft you might need to maintain persistence in these regions, but it's something worth investigating and something explored more in the report. So I want to look ahead. The report notes that there are policy temptations, there's a rocky road, and there's some things that we need to look forward that we need to avoid. We need to build a resilient hybrid architecture. We need to emphasize staying on track and building an architecture that spans LEO, MEO, and GEO. It's only recently that we've paid attention to proliferated LEO. LEO constellations offer great modalities. It might be possible very soon to put satellites up more cheaply than adversaries can shoot them down. But we want to have a complex constellation of multiple orbits capable of challenging adversaries' ability to synchronize attacks on space. What we really haven't heard is enough discussion about area threats to proliferated LEO constellations. We can't put all our eggs in the LEO basket. Shown here is just some of the orbital debris that's tracked in orbit. In the past year, the amount of collision avoidance maneuvers that needed to happen with the Starlink constellation were an order of magnitude greater than they were in the past 5 years combined. We're concerned that the intentional generation of debris, especially in low Earth orbit, could endanger such constellations and pose an area threat. Another area threat we've talked about in the report are nuclear pumping threats. This hasn't been discussed since the Cold War in enough detail, but there's a threat that nuclear tests, even performed over an adversary's own territory, could pump the LEO bands in a constellation with radiation, right? And it doesn't go straight out. It's kept in those bands by Earth's geomagnetic field and pose an area threat to proliferated LEO. So we can't put all our eggs in one basket. The second temptation we have to watch for is the temptation to over-optimize for coverage efficiency over schedule. In other words, we need to prevent from going to that yellow line that we were talking about in that graph. The early tranches of the Space Development Agency's architecture, Tranche 0 and Tranche 1, are built around highly inclined constellations for a reason. They're intent on spiraling to global coverage, and so these efficiencies are useful. But in Tranche 2, we welcome the addition of more lower inclined layers to build out that middle part of the capability curve. It's something expressly asked for by Congress to accelerate Indo-PACOM coverage, and we think that should be a priority moving forward with the architecture. Equally crucially, I'll note, we'll need to make sure that the ground systems and software infrastructure to actually use these satellites will be in place before they reach orbit. And finally, I want to close by talking about fire control. We're at a key junction, with the Missile Defense Agency handing off some of its missile defense fire control efforts to the Space Development Agency. And by fire control, we mean the capability to detect and track missiles with enough fidelity to actually guide an interceptor and deliver that capability. These challenges are linked. Better sensors mean cheaper interceptors. Sensors determine every other part of the missile defense kill chain, and that's why it's so important to get this right. The Missile Defense Agency is on the cusp of launching 2 prototype HBTSS satellites for exactly this mission. They're slated to launch early next year. And SDA Tranche 2 will incorporate 6 sensors, which you can see pictured there in pink, for fire control. But how do we scale this up? How do we move the schedule left? And how do we make sure that those requirements for fire control capability make it into the final architecture and make it into the warfighter's hands? So I want to thank everyone for attending. And I want to take a step back. This mission's really important. People's lives have been saved by space-based sensor capabilities, by space-based missile detection, by space-based missile tracking. And the time to modernize this, to add fire control capability, to add tracking capability, is long overdue. The future missile threat is very much going to look like the hypersonic missile threat. It's going to be lower. It's going to be faster. It's going to be more maneuverable. And sensors are the first link in this chain. It's why I'm so excited to release this report. I'm grateful for everyone, and I hope you read it. And I guess I'm pleased now to introduce Carrie Bingen, who is the director of the aerospace program here at CSIS, a great booster of all things space here at CSIS. Thank you so much.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Masao. And congratulations on this excellent comprehensive report. You actually brought me back to my 20s when I was the person in the back room doing STK analysis, but I know that was not the case here. You were not stuck in the back room. This report does a superb job of analyzing and especially visualizing the key issues and trade-offs that Masao described. I'd like to emphasize a key finding that he includes in the report, which is the future of missile defense and missile defeat will be contingent on the development, characteristics, and fielding timeline of a space sensing layer. The report highlights that there are no silver bullets, the importance of layered missile defenses and mixed orbits, particularly in the space sensing area. It talks about the need for global coverage and providing fire control tracking capabilities from space. I also want to say I very much appreciated your discussion on sensor and ground fusion and data integration. You mentioned that it's underappreciated, but it's absolutely essential to making the mission work. The best satellites don't do much good if the systems aren't integrated and the data isn't delivered in a format and timeline relevant to the tight intercept timelines. One of the great things about CSIS and the International Security Program here is that we have a lot of projects where we have common interests and a superb bench of scholars who are keen to collaborate. So I'm pleased that the Aerospace Security Project could contribute to the research over this past year. So I am glad to be here and be a part of the report release, and then to introduce this next segment, which is our panel of distinguished experts. So I'd ask the panelists to come join me up here on stage while I introduce each of them. So first, I'd like to welcome, and please come on up. I'd like to welcome John Hill, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space and Missile Defense. I've known John for many years. He has deep expertise, institutional knowledge, and he's a no-nonsense leader and counselor for so many that have passed through the Space Policy Office through the years. He keeps fellow seniors in line and mentors junior staff. He served as the Principal Director for Space Policy from 2013 to 2021 and has held a variety of assignments in the department beyond the space portfolio. He was DoD's representative in negotiations with Afghanistan on the Security and Defense Cooperation Agreement that enabled a post-2014 presence of U.S. and NATO forces. He has been involved in key international negotiations, and he's deeply respected internationally. John has had a key role in shaping our strong relationships with Japan in particular, as the Director for Northeast Asia and the Senior Country Director for Japan, and on detail to the government of Japan. And we in the Aerospace Project are especially fortunate to be able to tap into his extensive knowledge there. Next, we have Colonel Alexander Rasmussen, Chief of the Tracking Layer at the Space Development Agency. RAS is in a key position ensuring the development and delivery of a satellite constellation that will enable us to track hypersonic and advanced missiles. The proliferated warfighting space architecture at the Space Development Agency is breaking the mold in how to think differently about acquiring satellites. RAS has an extensive background in positioning, navigation, and timing, PNT. Today, nearly every ground combat system relies on PNT, mostly GPS. His jobs, he's had key program management roles in providing that assured PNT and GPS to soldiers on Army platforms. He has served as the first product manager for mounted PNT in support of Army Futures Command and the Program Executive Office for Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, and Sensors. Over his 2+ decade career, Colonel Rasmussen has also served in a variety of intelligence, armor, and acquisition assignments, including deployments to Kuwait and Iraq, and served in South Korea. Next, we have Rich Ritter, Program Executive for Sensors, Command and Control at the Missile Defense Agency. Rich has been involved in so many aspects of missile defense since he arrived, actually back at the Strategic Defense Initiative Office, September 1990, and currently serves as the Program Executive for Sensors, Command and Control. So when I think of JADC2, it's the work that Rich has been doing for years in the missile defense domain that brings JADC2 to life for me. He's responsible for the acquisition of C4ISR capabilities and, importantly, ensuring the connectivity of missile defense systems. So as you saw here from Masao, passing detection data from satellites to tracking radars and then targeting information to interceptors, connecting those disparate systems across different military services and different companies that build those systems. I'm also excited to have Ryan Tully here with us today. Ryan is a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee and staff lead for the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. Having been in his position, I know the tremendous amount of work that he does. He serves as a key advisor and staff expert to committee members and House leadership on U.S. missile defense and nuclear weapons policies and programs. Congratulations for getting the National Defense Authorization Act passed last week. Please help us with the appropriators. He also served on the National Security Council as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe and Russian Affairs. He's also an intelligence officer in the Navy Reserve and has extensive congressional knowledge from his time on the Senate Intelligence Committee and Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And then lastly, Masao needs no introduction, but we just heard from Masao Dahlgren, a fellow within the International Security Program and excellent scholar, as you've seen from his work here today. So thank you. I'd like to turn the floor over to Tom.
All right, well, thank you, Carrie, and thanks to all the panelists for coming out today. We're grateful you can join us to talk about where the department is on this important mission set. I've got a lot of questions for you, and we're going to have a great conversation, but I also want to emphasize that please do, you can submit questions online on the event page and through low latency data feeds through space. They're going to come right here, and I can present them to the panel. So let's just start off, I think, with the policy perspective. This topic was an important feature in the Missile Defense Review, John, that came out last November. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about kind of how we got here on the policy side. How do you characterize the drivers behind it, and maybe some of the key policy challenges that have yet still to be tackled?
Sure. So as you noted last week in testifying Congress, Ryan's, the committee where Ryan works. It
wasn't terrible.
No, I thought it was good. It was good engagement and good discussion with good questions with the members. I mean, making the point of missiles just being the weapon of choice, the way nations fight wars, and missile defense being not something that should be a policy debate. It's an essential part of a force posture. The sensor aspect that Masao gets into in the report is something we pointed out in the Missile Defense Review. We talked about the growing role of missile warning, missile tracking, missile defense sensors in space. In that context, The way I relate it to sort of the sense of what you're trying to do is, ideally you want to find things before they're launched. It's a different set of sensors than what Masao is focused on. Masao's report is focused on, if it's launched, what are the sensors we're going to have to deal with? And that's a topic in its own right. They're two related but distinct topic sets. And so once it's launched, you're trying to increase your probability of engagement success, and you're trying to improve your confidence in your battle damage assessment, your kill assessment. And so you have sensors for detecting and tracking, and you have sensors for, as you noted, for adding in fire control is something that's coming in with modern generations that we've not had in the past, where we were just focusing on missile warning. And Rich can talk more about the hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor that's going to be such an important part of it. Then you have a discriminating space sensor. That's another piece that Rich can talk to. You also have the sensors on the interceptors themselves. And then the fusion of all of that, which Kerry was just speaking to. So, I mean, it's a critical part of things, and it's why I was thinking that I didn't really much like the title of the report doesn't really do it justice. Getting on track is kind of blah. I thought maybe if you went with like, sensors and sensorabilities or something like that, you might,
rolls off your tongue.
you know, that would be a little bit more likely to sell, at least in the literature source. But it's really fundamental, and the policy that we put out in Missile Defense Review is very much saying this is where we have to go, because I need to reduce the numbers, whether it's regional, whether it's homeland missile defense. I want to reduce the numbers of interceptors I have to use for any engagement. And then, of course, as we also talked in Missile Defense Review, and as I said in my testimony last week, the missile defense is part of a posture. The posture also has to include your ability to respond to someone who has made the mistake of choosing to shoot at you. So, how about that for an opening remark, and then I'll let you.
All right, we're going to take a note, Masao, more Jane Austen allusions in our report titles.
I have no more of those.
Rich, I wonder if you could, before we kind of get into the programs, maybe you could pick up where John kind of left off in terms of giving an overview of the missions. Missile warning, missile track, and how MDA has been coming at those and thinking about those.
I'm glad to, and I don't like the title either, as you would tell, because what you outlined is not unique to hyperglide. I mean, it's the sexiest thing right now, but all the missiles are giving us a problem, as pointed out in your charts. For a lot of old-timers here that I've been working with, so you know this, but we're responsible right now. We cover 18 time zones with ground sensors and other equipment that we're responsible for. The problem is right now, the enemy is not going ballistic. They are rapidly going to maneuvering and other types of weapons, not just hypersonic. A long time ago, we started realizing, or as General Hyten would say, there's not enough islands in the Pacific to put radars on. There's got to be another way to do it. So we've been working the ability to go to space, as some of you know, for quite some time. That's taken not just a technology perspective, but as well as a funding perspective from the commercial world, but as well as getting people to understand that space can be affordable and it can provide the mission. People in the past with old SIBRs and that always thinking about missile warning. What's missile warning? Missile warning is it's launched. It doesn't answer the question as where is it going. In the past, we were pretty comfortable because when it was boosting, you figured out where it was going. You can't do that anymore. That gets the missile tracking, and then the missile defense. I would submit that while we try to argue money on that, on missile warning is cheaper, in reality, to do missile tracking, missile defense is actually supports missile warning and original functions. Today's day and age, I can't give you the number, but it's thousands and thousands of tracks we get every year. The political party and that's in power want to know, where is it going? How soon do I have, and what do I got to do? I can't do that with the existing systems. The problem we've had is we knew we needed to go lower altitudes, and that is what was discussed. But to get the department to understand the need for a constellation was much bigger than what could happen from a Missile Defense Agency perspective. So that's what brings together a lot of the jointness between the SDA, SSC, and ourselves. The ability, the commercial world has now proven that you can build satellites cheaply. And one of our original programs, some of you remember PTSS, the thing that was the killing was the launch costs. Launch costs has come down drastic since Falcon 9s became available. So we can affordable access to space, we can build smaller satellites, and we can monitor constellations and that kind of thing. Our role is, from an MDA perspective, we understand fire control. We understand what it takes to close the fire control loop and take the enemy out. Our expertise is not necessarily in operating constellations and that kind of thing. If Derek Tenier was here, but Raz can handle it all by himself, is that what their job is to take not the high risk, but to take low risk technologies and bring it to the next stage and operationalize it and bring it in. So that's the connection between us. On HBTSS, our two vendors proved on the ground that you saw the one chart of being able to suck the target out of the background environment. That was the big seller. Next trick is to prove that you can really do it in space. That's why the launch, hopefully this next quarter, will go up, and we have 2 of the HBTSS birds and 4 of the wide field of view birds going up, and will really demonstrate the ability to be able to do this with high confidence. After that point, it's over to Raz and his guys to go deliver. But we are tightly connected, and as a group, not just with the space stuff, but also with the facilities on the ground. We have a combined program office structure with LA and SSC and ourselves. Typically what happens if you're a career space guy, you get the satellite up there and everything is catching up. We got the ground environment here now. I can talk to an Aegis afloat, I can talk to a THAAD or whatever, and we have that infrastructure where we can get it to them quickly and close the kill chain. We're waiting for the space sensors to come in and do their thing. One of the things that came up, and if it works it later, you mentioned the idea of fusion. A lot of the fusion, we have worked a lot of that. We know how to take the 2D and 3D data, which is in this report, and turn it to 3D data and get it to the shooter. We know how to take OPIR data and radar data, we do it every day, and bring it to the shooter. So we're doing a lot, but the real issue is, can the space domain, can it deliver what we're saying we can deliver it on time and the cost? And that's what we're working together with SDA, and SSC is not here, but they're part of it because of the NEO structure. The only other thing is we're just not, our contribution to the space guys in reverse is we got the radars out there. What does the Space Force guys need? They need space domain awareness, that stuff. So we've started to work out the combination between the two, where we can provide the data like from LRDR and the other stuff, and in turn they work the space OPIR and the other data and bring it back to us. So it's an enterprise within an enterprise that's working very well together. It's the challenge for the future, but I think it's got high payoff for the warfighter. Over.
Thank you, Rich. That segues very nicely over to Colonel Rasmussen for maybe just give us an update on kind of the SDA vision and where you're at on the tranches, and maybe a little bit of a peek in where you're going here, there, turn.
Great, thanks. First, I want to say that was a great brief, great report. I appreciate covering everything from policy to the tech. So that was outstanding. It's good to have an external entity looking at the problems that we're looking to deliver on. For SDA, we're after delivering beyond line of sight targeting. So we can look at moving targets anywhere in the world and get after those most pressing threats, hypersonics or advanced missile threats. And that's great. Satellites are fun, but ultimately we got to get the data where it needs to go. So we're focused on low latency, initially using existing data formats and architectures. As Mr. Ritter said, from NDA's already established those. We're plugging into those. That integration has already started, taking advantage of those fusion efforts there. So we're looking at beyond line of sight targeting to get after those most pressing threats and using the existing architectures and data formats that we have today. And it's really been a good partnership with NDA and SSC. We're all very focused on what we need to do, what we need to deliver, given the importance of this mission and how fast things are moving in terms of space and technology and the threats. So we have SDA focusing on that LEO layer, our SSE teammates at MEO, and working with MDA on fire control. Couple of things we'll highlight there on the fire control. I think it's a great success story. We like to highlight HBTSS. SDA is absolutely going to exploit the successes there. That has passed through the valley of death, as they say, to be able to take that capability. We've got it, part of it in T1 and T2, and as able to proliferate moving down in the future. So it's just a great story, and I know there's more things in the pipeline that we're talking about, how NDA is reducing risk, understanding the requirements, understanding the technology, so SDA can proliferate that in that spiral development approach every couple of years. So we'd like to say we're working with everybody, can't do it by ourselves, but we are absolutely focused on the warfighter and the COCOMs and the services themselves. We meet with them on a regular basis with MDA and SSC to understand, hey, what are they seeing? What are they seeing for a threat? How are they going to respond to the threat in terms of tactics and their mission areas? And also, what are they seeing in terms of technology? So we bring that in. We take advantage of that spiral development approach. Every 2 years, we're launching new capabilities. So we can defer pretty easily to the next tranche, and the warfighter doesn't have to wait very long. And I'm part of that. SDA has been a joint organization. That's why I'm the Army person up here with the Space Development Agency. Absolutely believe in delivering capability, working with our Space Force partners. And of course, I have to leave with the trivia question is you can all look up, who was the first one in the U.S. to launch a satellite for the U.S.? There you go.
All right, we'll come back to it. Ryan, I know the answer, but I'm not going to say it. Ryan, over to you. I wonder if you might give us kind of a snapshot of the congressional perspective. How are you seeing these issues, these capabilities discussed on the Hill from a multi-party perspective, and maybe how things might have changed on that front?
Sure, happy to do it. So first of all, sensors and sensibilities, that's definitely going to be the topic of our first hearing in January. You're all being invited. Strat Forces Subcommittee. No, one of the nice things about my job, and it's much different than I'm sure when Kerry had it or a couple of folks in between, is that it's kind of morphed from one of the more partisan kind of contentious issues to one of the more bipartisan issues where you're seeing a lot of consensus. Now, part of that is the technology evolving over the last decade or so, but a lot of that has to do with our adversaries, Russia, China, what you're seeing right now in Ukraine and Israel, and how missile defenses are able to buy policymakers time for decisions and buy them decision space. And that's proven to be invaluable in a lot of these conflicts. And you're seeing the demand for missile defense assets go way up. And so when we're developing the NDAA or the appropriations bills, it's actually one of the things where you're seeing the most consensus. The thing where you're seeing the most probably contention there is how fast should you go and how much money and resources should be put behind it. And I mean, those are conversations that are having within the margins, though. They're intellectually honest, they're policy decisions, and you're seeing a lot of intellectual rigor go behind those type of things. And when folks like John come up, he's getting questions that are much more policy-oriented and not more political-oriented than I think some of the other committees up on Capitol Hill these days. So that's nice, and it's refreshing. One other anecdote I'll give is that when we had the NDA markup this year, missile defense used to receive dozens of amendments, and you'd have votes on 20 or so of those. We had zero missile defense votes this year.
Wow.
We had 3 strat votes. They were all nuke-related. So that's a little bit different than
I see Carrie over there.
Yeah, 2 in the morning, hashing it out. No, it's a little bit different than that. So that's refreshing.
Thanks, Ryan. Masao, do you want to kind of react to some of the things said so far?
Oh, yeah. No. First, in our defense, with regards to the title, I believe that it was Aerospace's Carrie Bingen, Caitlin Johnson, who I did a lookup before we were coming up with the title, and I thought of that exact title. I thought of it too. And we looked it up, and Caitlin Johnson was there before us. As she is with so many things. So shout out to Caitlin if she's listening, but I really wish we could have taken that name. That's what I'll say.
All right. Well, hey, why don't we start to nerd out a little bit here on some of the themes that the paper talked about, Masao, in terms of things like resilience. What does regional coverage mean? Why is that important? How do we think about balancing efficiency versus schedule and these kinds of things? Raz, do you want to maybe take a stab at some of those, react to some of the themes that were brought up there?
Sure, a lot of the things mentioned by Masao, we're absolutely trying to get after and taking advantage of the entire community in terms of what is needed. Ultimately, we want to provide multiple sensors looking at any point in the globe at any given time, or we say stereo coverage or even greater than that, robust coverage. So we're looking whatever orbitology works best. As mentioned in Tranche 2, in Tranche 1 we were near polar inclinations, and in Tranche 2 we're bringing it down to get closer to equatorial. And that's to get after how do we provide the best coverage across the globe to all of the war fighters there. And we're learning as we move forward to Tranche 3. We may tailor that a little bit more, a little closer to the equator or in between, as we talked about before. So we're very open to that, and we're taking advantage of that spiral approach to that. And you said one other thing.
I think the mixed orbits, the inclinations, and also just the concept of resilience. I'll just say, John Plum was here a couple months ago, and however many months ago, and I think it was there, he said, what we're finding is that resilience is a never-ending quest.
Right.
And so how do you answer how much is enough on the resilience side?
Right, so our number one approach to resiliency is proliferation. What's the right number there? We certainly work through all the simulations on that. And then we also have, in coordination with SSC and the MEO layer, how do we make sure we put our orbits in the right inclinations and the right spacing so that they have the right coverage at all given times, and kind of run those simulations. Okay, hey, how many satellites do you have to take out before one of the architectures has a problem? So we do a lot of that thinking. We don't want to get too much. We want to keep the satellites at a certain price point. So we do look at some very basic resiliency items in our at the LEO layer, but we're using proliferation and then bringing on a new tranche every 2 years.
Well, let me just sort of stay with a piece of the hardware in general for infrared, and that's kind of the focal plane arrays.
Right.
And I'd be curious kind of how you're thinking about the size of the FPAs, whether they're gimbaled, whether it's wide field of view, medium field of view. You saw some of the kind of the depictions of those trade-offs as well. I wonder maybe Rich, Raz, whoever wants to take a look at that.
He says me first. So we're looking to provide the mission, provide that global stereo coverage, so we have the ability to do fire control anywhere in the world, missile warning, missile tracking. So initially we're doing wide field of view for T1 and T2 to get after the missile warning, missile tracking mission. We don't necessarily dictate the size of an FPA. We look at performance. So we've had good engagement with the industry on where the maturity of the FPAs are and the manufacturability, which is a big thing. So we don't really dictate that. For wide field of view right now, the MIN-BP is missile warning, missile tracking, and fire controls down, looking to proliferate in T3. What we're going to look to learn here in T1 and T2 is where we have, specifically at the poles, where we have multiple sensors looking at any one place at one time, is how good can that precision get? So as we saw on the charts there, when you have the wide field of view versus a narrow field of view, well, if you have 3 or 4 wide field of views looking at the same place at the same time, and I'm kicking that over to MDA and they're fusing it all together, that may get you down to narrow field of view type sensitivity. So that's kind of how we're looking on that. But having a gimbal solution does give you some abilities in terms of tasking and that. So that's why we've been including HPTSS in T1, and we're going to have other fire control solutions in T2 to inform where we're going. Do we need to have a median field of view gimbaled in T3, or can we do it all with persistent fixed wide field of view sensors?
Building on what Raz just laid out, we have no preference. We have a set of requirements we want. We're looking to industry to help solve the requirements, and we do have a mix. So, one of the answers that we have provided before is, how big a production line you're going to have and continue, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe that's the wrong question. I think the real question is, go back to the SDA strategy. Tranche 3, the commercial world is advancing so quick. There may be other approaches that they can come up with, and bigger FPAs are not necessarily the answer, by the way. Actually, that causes a problem in some of the loading. But there is the architecture and the physical structure of those satellites by Tranche 3, no doubt in my mind, will look different than what we have in Tranche 1 or 0. The other thing is, I think there is some payoff for the future, for the space community, for the space enterprise themselves too. And I think hopefully the satellites, when they're up there, they're not tracking ballistic missiles. They can be used for other space domain awareness functions. So we're looking at that from both perspectives. The interesting thing, I'm going to take you on a tangent a little bit. There's 3,500 satellites right up there at LEO right now. When we do a missile test, we have to get within seconds to go launch so we don't hit something. It's that cluttered up there right now, and it's going to get worse. So tie in that space domain awareness with the missile defense guys and everything else is critically important. Over.
Well, let me pull the thread, Rich, with your complaint about the subtitle only saying hypersonic and not the ballistic thing. So maybe let's stay with that. Ryan, the NDA, I think it was last year, had some legislative provisions about the fire control requirements and things like that. I was first asked, how do you see some of the congressional intent, the congressional language in terms of the cold body, the ballistic tracking as well? The hypersonic stuff's getting a lot of attention, but what about that legacy ballistic threats, RVs, from space?
No, I think that, well, we did put it in. It was the FY23 NDAA, and I brought it with me.
He brings it with him.
Yeah.
Doesn't leave home with that.
Yeah. Requirement for fire control data requirement. Yeah, there it is. So no, it's something that's not lost on us that HBTSS has both hypersonic and ballistic also in the name, right? I think one of the ways that we're kind of looking at it is to make sure that this relationship is as good as everybody says it is, but also that when you're looking at fire control data, that it actually is what the program offices say that they need for their individual munition. That it's not just fire control data that's slapped on the side of everything, kind of like a bumper sticker, and that it actually gets the warfighter what they need. So, I mean, that's kind of how we look at it from the oversight perspective, talking to the different program offices, talking to the different primes, trying to understand the whole gamut of things that Rich kind of hit on. But we're going to have some different hearings next year. I know that this is going to be an issue that a bunch of our members are going to want to hit on. One of the other things that I think we're looking at is the synergies between what we're doing on the offensive side and what we're doing on the defensive side, and how, if CPS and LRHW can get up and get some more tests up, then these guys can kind of look at that a little bit more and can kind of tone their algorithms and kind of adjust what they're doing from the defensive side. So
Gotcha.
There are definitely some synergies, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to increase corridors where you can do testing to try and get some of the EIS requirements out of the way and to try and get the offensive side going a little bit more, so to hone these guys' tools.
So now, Ryan, you said, you can't just slap fire control on like a bumper sticker. It is going to be, of course, contingent upon the other elements of the kill chain. So let me come back perhaps to you two gentlemen, whoever else wants to jump in, is like, no kidding, how do you go about refining the fire control requirements for, let's just stay with hyper glide defense right now, seeing as we don't have the missile yet, and it's still in the competitive phase, for instance. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Within the Missile Defense Agency, we have a set of rigid standards and engineering descriptions of what we need to get the job done. And that includes what's the fire control quality data you need. Aegis, for example, has a fire control quality that we meet all the time. Sitting off in the Gulf right now with the Tippy radars in there, that relationship exists. We have documented that same standard. It's in the SWAC and the study that some of you have seen on the Hill on what do we need for fire control. It's documented in operational requirements, and it's documented in system specifications that are then passed back and forth. As Raz said, they're down there at Dahlgren today reaffirming what do they need to go do the glide phase interceptor. I mean, the glide phase interceptor will work fine with a cube from another ship, but when you look at the massive distances and range it can go with an overhead, it's unbelievable. So that's that. We're trying to document it just like we did with interoperability and everything else. This is what you need to be a team member and play in the game. So we're exercising that.
Maybe I can bounce back to you, Ryan, for just a second there. The latest NDAA that just passed had some provisions about glide phase interceptor, including some years, 2029 IOC, for instance. And you, I think, added $225 million to that program as well. So how do you think about the relation between GPI timeline and the sensor timeline?
Well, that and also the threat timeline too, because we're kind of in that window. So when you talk to not just the IC, but also our partners and allies, how they're seeing the threat materialize, and what you're seeing actually in Ukraine right now, where you have Patriot going up against certain missiles with hypersonic capabilities, the threat's here now, and based on what we've heard, it's really not a technology development issue. It's more of a resource issue, and that's. John and I had a little discussion on it before we came out here, and it's a prioritization issue too. So, if you put the resources behind GPI, could it get there, and do us and the Japanese kind of see that same threat space? And we do from our committee, because we put the additional funds behind it. We'll see if the appropriators match it, or if we're stuck in a CR for any particular length of time. But the threat's here, and we believe it should be accelerated.
Anything on your side?
Sure. Well, so the committee has the NDAA provision in there that we'll be having to take on the question you've asked and provide the committee some report response this year, analyzing those various questions. What is the pace of the threat? What are the options for adjusting the timeline on that? And then, as Ryan notes, you've got lots of challenges across the defense budget, and where are you going to put your priorities?
Regardless, 25 is going to be a really tough one, right? And you're going to see some hard choices being made across multiple different programs. The nice part about us, from the Hill perspective, is we get to go second. You have to submit your budget first, and then we get to make adjustments to it. So there's that.
I'll just add real quick, I don't know if it was clear, is today the SCA tracking team went down to the GPI office. We've had a number of virtual connections, and so this was the in-person visit to start really talking, hey, regardless of how that timeline ends up flushing out, how budgets work out, they're working on that plan together, understand, okay, exactly, it isn't just data formats, it's exactly what does that interceptor need initially on the ground using existing architectures, and even thinking down the road when we're talking space to Aegis, or space to the actual interceptor to reduce that latency. So really not just talk, there's actual work going on between the agencies to get after that fire control capability.
And from everything we've heard, right, there's two really good teams that are working on it too, from the industry perspective. We'd prefer to see the competition kind of go forward. We've seen the benefits of having that competition. Again, there'll be some really tough decisions that appear to be coming down as far as what can fit into our top line and what can't, but we get to go second.
Raz's comment highlights something that is really important. When you're getting to this range of missiles, glide phase interceptors, you're talking missiles that can be going thousands of kilometers. And your sensor coverage has to be able to cover trans-regionally, globally. So, and they could be used for strikes from the other side of the world against the United States, strikes against our allies. And so it's the sensor area in particular is an area where you also have opportunities for, when you get your standards right and your data formats right, actually leveraging your allies and partners who have a shared interest in being able to defend themselves and defend in alliances to prevent a deterrence perspective from an alliance. That integration that you can achieve in the sensor side it's a growth opportunity for us, but I think that is something we'll be seeing more of too.
I know it sounds like the sensors are just an easy policy issue. We talked about bipartisan and all this kind of thing, but John, you just mentioned the allies there. Mm-hmm. I mean, now we're going to be cooperative development with Japan. From a policy perspective, how are you thinking about the data sharing, on the front end, so that we don't get into a situation some years hence where everybody wants a hyperglide killer, but don't necessarily have access to the data?
It's essential, and so and it's important to Japan. They've been very clear about that because they know having a missile that doesn't have access to the sensor data that it's going to need to do the mission is not going to give you a very good return on your investment. So that's understood up front that you have to do that, and we do a lot of data sharing with our allies right now, but another aspect, and this gets to the airborne layer portion of the study, a lot of current generation airborne sensor capabilities, not in the missile area so much, but more battle space awareness, they're moving to space because they have to, because of anti-access area denial. Well, just because data moves to space doesn't mean you have to have a whole new classification regime on it. If you've been sharing this data in your combatant commands for years because you've been fighting in coalitions and combatant commands, you should be doing it the same way from space and continuing to share. So as we think about, well, what's the space contributions to missile defense, that's the mindset we have to have. It is some culture change, but we're leaning into that.
As I mentioned, missile defense is 18 time zones right now. I want to bring up the point that today we do share data, shooting data, and that with Japan, NATO, Israel, and a number of the GCC countries. So that basis has already been pretty well set. The other thing that's interesting, missile defense guys deal in state vectors. We talk about messages and that. They deal in state vectors. I'm going to kill something. Yep. Traditional space guys do collection data things. So trying to convince the space guys that it was different and that you got to have a 3D capability to go nail the guy it's been a tough learning curve.
A cultural change.
It's a culture change.
But now, the space community, in addition to having missile defense, so if you're talking about tracks, ground-moving target indicator tracks moving to space, that's a mission where space people are running that. I'm not just supporting watching things. I'm actually supporting the terrestrial domains in their targeting domains. So I think you're going to see this in multiple areas.
I agree.
And I think they're there.
And if you can't share it, again, useless, right? So it gets back to the
You
classification
have to.
issue. Yeah.
Well, yeah, if you don't enable if your coalition is a strategic advantage and you don't actually work with your coalition, then maybe it's not a strategic advantage. You have to do it. We've done this before. We've done this across domains. We just need to keep building on that.
Yeah, no, it's a lot like the Brits come in whenever they want to talk AUKUS, and they talk no foreign. I mean, this is a complete rabbit hole, but still, it's something that they bring in at every single one of their meetings.
Well, we've got a question come in.
On AUKUS.
Yeah, lots going on there, Pillar 2. Steve Trimble from Aviation Week asked, and this is a two-parter. Hold on, buckle up. GAO has reported that HBTSS can provide engage on remote capability. And SDA's PWSA is limited, he says, to launch on remote. Can you break down what that means? What's the minimum necessary for defense against HGVs? And is it possible to provide either capability from MEO given latency problems?
Jeez, not much.
Good technical question.
Well, first of all,
Way to go, Steve.
It sounds like your definition problem, launch on remote, engage on remote. Launch on remote means I'm I've got it underway, but I'm going to close the fire loop within my own organic sensor. Engage on remote means I'm going to send it and the weapon's going to close. I mean, that's an important distinction. On the hyperglide and all that, we're still trying to sort out where it's on engage on remote. It can jinx and janks all over the place, and how to work those kinds of issues is still in a development kind of stage. And Raz, you may have some, I lost track of the other part of the question.
So we took the requirements from HBTSS, and that's what we're getting after in T2. T1 is the actual HBTSS payloads integrated into the PWSA, so we can learn about not just the performance, but also the concepts of operations, how you get that data down into the C2BMC, the MDA network, into the COCOMs, so we can start with getting to Aegis that way. In T2, we had MDA part of our source selection, and we're looking at their requirements again to get that. And so in terms of those engaging a remote, launch remote, really we're trying to reduce the timeline for that sensor to shooter. We'll use the existing networks as mentioned, using the expertise that's already there, and then as we can, spiral in that capability to go straight from space down to an Aegis cruiser or straight from space to the interceptor. And we're working together on exactly what that requirement is, but it'll be informed by the threat, informed by the mission.
Let me just add one on to him. What we propose to the industry partners is you have to get it within a box. And if you can get it within a box, you can go ahead and execute it. What Raz pointed out, it'll mature over time. We're going to be heavily tied to the ground initially. As we grow on, the point is to get more of it up to space, but we're crawl walking, but we're making progress. Instead of waiting for the ultimate answer 10 years from now, we're getting capability out there now and prove that we can do it.
So since you just mentioned the ground a couple times there along the way, Masao's report talks about, quote, a constellation design will live and die by its data transport and integration. And so there's a lot of attention on getting a bunch of satellites up. But how are you thinking about, maybe start with you, Raz, or anybody else? Ryan, be curious on your perspectives on this as well, about fusing that data. I know Rich talked about that a little bit, but also kind of that background clutter and all the ground stuff. And, oh, by the way, the resiliency of the ground assets as well.
Sure. Right. So a couple things. We got to have the ground in place before we launch. We've had that guidance from Mr. Cavelli, the Space Force. From lessons learned, there's a lot of scars on ground where we've launched some cool stuff and couldn't do anything with it. So our ground is already being put in place. As mentioned, the ground integration is already ongoing with MDA and others. Can geek out a little bit here. We have standardized messages, but who knew? The messages aren't really that standardized. You have to go through each block of that message, thousands of blocks, and define exactly how do you put different types of sensors in there. We have some great industry partners delivering different approaches to get after the same requirements. So how does a fusion engine like BOA get after that? So we've already come together between SSC, MDA, ourselves, and others, gone through that line by line of that message standard format and already got it approved by the people who manage that. So that's how we're getting after that initially, really geeking out on that on the ground. And then for SDA, we have multiple operation centers on that. That's one of the ways we get after resiliency. Also with the PWSA, or the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, going to be the backbone of JADC2, we have multiple data pathways that we can get that data down into theater, whether that's existing networks that we have or down the road, however a particular COCOM or service can receive that data. That's where we'll have some resiliency in terms of how the data flows.
I think if I could add to what Raz said, the other thing we've been working together with, if you go out to SpaceX or the other places, you got a handful of people running the whole constellation. You go to a typical Air Force, Space Force thing, you got hundreds of people. We're trying to get the people to understand we got to have constellations with automation that are self-autonomous. We cannot have these large armies on the ground supporting these things. So they're doing a lot of work in the AI portion of the world and how to get that manning down. And that's a key your point was well taken. It's well part of the resilience. It's not just the space, it's the ground as well.
General Dickinson was here last month, and he loves to point out that the Army is the biggest user of space.
I'd like to point that out, too.
Then you pay the bill.
This is not going the way I wanted it to.
Well, let me try to bring up another policy question for you, John. The report talks about kind of the nuclear pumping issue, the high altitude atmospheric testing. How do you deter that? And you know, how do you work around that? It seems like a hard fit for our nuclear retaliation kind of a threat. So how do you think about that? And again, how does that inform how we think about the resiliency, multi-orbits, and that sort of thing?
Well, it's always been there. It has always been there. And most nations figured out quite a long time ago that probably testing in ways that would cause those disruptions is not in their own individual interest, much in anybody else's individual interest. Ultimately, the challenge with deterrence, of course, is that when things are going okay, you assume that maybe deterrence is working, or maybe it's just that nobody has an interest in doing it in the first place. You only know about it when deterrence fails. That's when you know that it has happened. That's the troubles with it. But so we've always had to design certain architectures, the ones that have to be there in the nuclear environment, for that will continue to perform the mission in a nuclear environment. And that's part of the deterring. That's part of assuring that my ability to impose costs in response is assured. The related question you ask is one of, is there anyone who is so desperate that they want to do that kind of damage to the world's use of space? It is actually an attack on the world's use of space, and the world's becoming so dependent upon that. It is something that you want to continue to maintain an environment in which no one sees that to their advantage.
So let me shift now to some of the alternative sensors. We've talked a lot about infrared, FPAs, and that sort of thing. But I'd be curious to get folks' reaction, and Masao, feel free to jump on in here as well, about multispectral, hyperspectral, space-based radars, radio frequency in general. First of all, stuff up there, but then also so-called legacy ground-based radars as well, for instance, today. So as we think about this, moving beyond just the infrared, what are the aspects there?
I mean, we have the ground-based stuff too, right? Like LDRD coming on board, that'll be huge. We're repurposing the Hawaii radar down to Guam. That'll be a big add down there. All the Aegis systems that we have. So I mean, like, it's part of the resiliency part that you talked about earlier. But it also, I think, from a policy perspective, when your adversary's coming up and he's got to actually put a munition on lands that'll actually probably take U.S. service members' lives, it's a different calculation for him than going up against a space sensor. But I don't know if you have anything to add on the other type of phenomenologies.
I think this is a really exciting area. And, in last year's report, we had a lot of talk about, hypersonic weapons, the things that make them so dangerous are also what makes them so vulnerable. Flying in the hypersonic environment, maybe they're vulnerable to different types of kill mechanisms. They fly on the edge of their design margins, and maybe there's things we can do there. That was the theme of last year's report. And I think the same applies in this year. I wish I had more time to go into this at the beginning, but of course we're on a timeline. But the hypersonic weapons have novel signatures. There might be other ways of looking at a hypersonic weapon or detecting them that aren't just infrared. And the report calls for a little bit more attention to exploiting some of those unique characteristics. There's a lot of work being done right now, for example, on on the wakes and the plumes left by hypersonic weapons. These things are flying at extreme speeds through air. The plasma that surrounds them rips molecules off of the vehicle surface. There's chemical reactions that release maybe novel wavelengths of light. And so there's more than one way to get at this problem. And that's something that I hope will receive more emphasis and will be a contribution of this report.
Rich, you want to say anything about the radars, for instance, given your portfolio?
Well, a couple things. We'll always have a mix of radars and overheads. And the overheads won't necessarily be continuously OPIR. I can see other sensor technologies coming online. The OTH is an interesting capability. And I believe the merit of that, and we're experimenting with that as we speak. The issue that General Van Herkscott and everything else, he wants to know about the air threat to the United States. And it's not just hypersonics or all that, it's the regular cruise missiles, et cetera. We have talking to the druggies down at Key West and the other ones, it's important to do tip and cue to figure out. If anybody's ever seen a screen on an OTH radar, you got to be like the sonar guys in the old movies, Sparky, it's over here. You need something to cue it off. But if we had OPIR, for example, to go tip it off that it's on its way, you can pass it to an OTH operator and he can tag it. You can figure out where it's going and what to do. So I think we got to get out of this one bullet takes care of all. In reality, it's the clever operators, just like you see in Ukraine, be able to put things together in mixes that you didn't think about to be able to baffle the enemy and sort it out. So,
And once again, it comes back to the fusion engines in the ground.
yeah, and a fusion it might be your head.
Yeah, that could be part of it.
Yeah.
Let's hope it's not that.
Yeah.
We've got another question that's come in. This is for Ryan Tully. Quote, given the timing of the deployments of HBTSS and the SDA tracking layer, what near-term testing tools will be available to demonstrate the capabilities of those systems against enemy hypersonic threats? I think you were talking about the importance of testing, but other near-term opportunities, if
I can talk it as well. So a couple things coming up with the HBTSS launch. They'll have T0 tracking satellites on as well. So they'll be in the same plane where we'll be able to do some tip and cue between them, see what it looks like when a wide field of view and an HBTSS is looking at something at the same time. But we're really plugged into the entire enterprise, whether it's offensive or defensive, in terms of tests that are ongoing. Fortunately, there's a lot going on there with MACH-TB. So opportunistically, we'll participate in any test as long as it works out for timing of orbits and their schedules. We're well plugged in, have those schedules. We had a near opportunity to look at an MDA test recently. Didn't quite line up because we only have 4 right now for T0, but in later or early next year, we've already got plans to participate in some MDA tests and other agencies as well, whether it's offensive or defensive, to take advantage of that.
okay. Well, maybe we'll shift a little bit to the, I would say the industrial base and to supply chains. I know, Ryan, this came up in your hearing last week, kind of for missile defense generally, but I think just for the panel, for anybody who wants to chime in, first of all, what are some of the supply chain choke points for this set of capabilities that you're tracking? What are some of the cost drivers, and what are the trends do you see there? Those are maybe a couple things to kick off.
So, since you mentioned me, I'll start. I mean, workforce is one, right? So providing predictability to the industrial base, whether mostly budgetary, but that's why we did a lot of multi-year procurements, and it's much more on the munitions side than it is on the sensor side. We were able to update some of the procurements language in the bill this year to give the departments and agencies kind of a wider scope for what they could use them for. I mean, this just is authorizations, mainly relating to replenishment for Ukraine, Israel, or potential Taiwan scenario. But also trying to encourage co-production and co-development. Again, sharing technology, but also sharing workforce and trying to alleviate some of those, human capital bottlenecks.
Anybody else on the supply chain and industrial base?
I think I took the question for the record last week, so.
You've already answered it, yeah.
There's supply chain issues, obviously, for equipment and all that. And sometimes it's not the big guys, it's their sub-tier down that are stretched. But what I'm seeing on my side, because I don't have big production like Raz has, but software engineering, that know software engineering and critical mission system kind of software. I mean, most of those people they can't work from home. And trying to get that talent has actually been as we're making last minute changes in HPTSS and that, to try to get those kind of folks in has been tough.
One of the other things I'd say is access to facilities, right?
Yeah.
You want to make sure everything's rad hardened so we don't have another program that will not go named here.
Too soon.
Yeah, too soon. But access to those type of facilities, so that way all your parts can be certified and everything like that. And there's a bottleneck to try and get into a lot of those places. And
That's a good
there's also a bottleneck of programs that are coming up too that are going to need access to them, whether it's GPI, GPI, Sentinel. They're all the same facilities.
One thing, I mentioned the funding stability, but the predictable competition for industry across both SDA's tracking layer as well as SSC and the MEO layer. Right now it's aligned where every year you're going to have some competition between the epics and the tranches to be able to compete. We look at having multiple vendors or partners in each tranche really helps reduce risk in terms of having everything with one prime, but also looking at the primes, investing in a lot of different suppliers. You know, one of the successes I think we've had is OCTs. You know, in T0, we got a couple going, T1 between tracking and transport, some more coming online, and as they continue to scale up, they're reducing risk for future tranches and epics. And a similar story is there for FPAs. We've got 3 different FPA providers between LEO and MEO, which is really good for the future, as well as other subcomponents.
I think that it is also highlighted a lot in the report, the FPA matter. You know, it's so hard to take these really esoteric supply chain things and tie them in with the mission, and tie them in with why we should care, why is this the goal that we're going for. And I think we had a really good conversation earlier about that. But you know, when you're looking at these trades between fields of view, fire control versus tracking, these different qualities of data, the availability of FPAs was really important. And you flag, you know, the algorithm work is really important to getting that precision there. And so I was glad to see that also reflected in the final material.
Well, I wonder if we could kind of wrap things up by looking to the future. You know, here we are, 2023, got a lot of stuff going on in the 2020s, this decade. But what are some things that still need to be done? John, you mentioned a DSS program for the future. As we think about, you know, the threats of 2045 and how bad everything seems to be getting, what ought we be doing even if just on the S&T side of the house to begin looking at those things? So sort of future-oriented, whether it be policy, techniques, what have you.
Sure. Well, as I started off, and you mentioned discriminating space sensor, space-based kill assessment, hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor, proliferated architectures, the ground radars that people put in, they're not going away. They're definitely a key part of the future architecture. It's just a different balance and mix of what you're looking at, and is recognizing that different parts of that architecture have different vulnerabilities. So you're spreading your risk at different points and reducing the advantage that an adversary gets by attacking any individual node, because your network is able to reroute in multiple ways, so it's harder to take your network down. That's kind of what you have to, at a grand scheme level, try to put out there. You want to do that first and foremost. You want to be tracking where your threat is before your threat ever gets launched. So that's another part of the problem. Again, it's a sensor-based mission area in part. And then you have to recognize that the sensors tying into the missile defense is, as I said in the beginning, missile defense is a piece of your force posture. It's an essential piece of it because it is part of assuring your ability to respond with whatever military force is necessary. It's part of backing up your deterrence commitments, whether they're to yourself or whether they're to your interests as seen in your alliances. I think we'll continue to see that broad framework at a strategic level, and the technology will go down many of the paths we've been discussing here, but I'll turn to the experts on that. If they wanted to go further into
What does
those.
2045 hold? What sort of things should we be thinking about for the future?
Well, in 25, the key thing is our competition's going on with the glide phase and the GBI. We got to bring that to conclusion and get through CDRs and really get a strong basis to go execute. But and then the threat is changing drastically. The Koreans are catching up. You know, we used to treat them like the third world or whatever, but you know, they're getting closer to peer-peer kind of stuff. So I think we need to start focusing down on that neck of the woods too.
They got a long ways to go to get there.
Yeah, but you know what I'm getting at.
I think to prepare for the future, the best thing we can do is build that foundation now, so we continue to respond and adapt and take advantage of advances in technology to respond to threats. And a big part of that is all the things. It's not just the tech. Sometimes we focus on developing the tech, but we need the changes in the policy, we need the changes in acquisition to support a very responsive approach, a spiral development every 2 years doing this. How can we change the institutions and the cultures to support that, to have that wartime focus almost now, so we're not surprised later, is what we really get after. And then we can work on those tech pipelines, all those things, and we can continue doing demos like we do with HBTSS and T1, so we can continue to kind of maintain that overmatch against the threat. So big thing in my mind is build that foundation so all the things that mentioned in your report support the delivery of that capability.
2045, I don't know, probably that in my handicap, I would think, right? The industrial base, right? The industrial base. Ukraine's kind of exposed a lot of some of the flaws that are there, but we've also taken steps to fix that, to increase our ability to produce munitions, to get the human capital problem right, to get the workers we need. And it's not missile defense, it's not just munitions, it's submarines, it's a whole host of things across the entire industrial base. And so I think taking this next couple of years to get that right so that we're better prepared for whatever the next conflict is.
So, Zal, what do you think about the future, and maybe what's the next big report topic you want to tackle?
Well, 2045, I think by then hopefully we'll come up with better report names. That'll be number one. But when I'm thinking about the future, the big takeaway to me from this report is how complex the problem is, how many things you need to integrate across various domains, various organizations. I mean, this is the reason we have such a big panel. And to me, you know, when I look at this problem, I think, how do you measure success? How do you get better at doing that? How do you get better at connecting, you know, your discussion of focal plane arrays to the discussion of the requirements for the kill box you need for the glide phase interceptor that, oh, by the way, we're co-developing with Japan. And so if we can think of better oversight mechanisms, better ways of assessing programs and analyzing them, I think that would be a successful future.
Great. Well, look, thanks to everybody who came out. Again, thanks to everybody who has contributed in one way or another to this undertaking, and thanks to all of you folks for coming out and illuminating us on what's going on. So please join me in thanking the panel for their thoughts.